had sex with a mule. Slavery and affliction for a total of 400 years, and in another, of sojourning.
Even though it calls us strangers or foreigners in the land, that's not a challenge to us being indigenous to the Americas, which would be the other end of the earth. We've been afflicted with plagues. Yes, we've seen war, but we've actually lost more lives to the plagues.
Spanish flu. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Aniyun Wiya, reporting live on behalf of the Great Spirit, Aye, I share, Aye, to let you know that despite what they done told you, your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness and your law is the truth, not theirs. Let me tell you what I'm vibing on today. Sefer Bereshit, which Christians refer to as the Book of Genesis, actually prophesied as far back as you can go the transatlantic slave trade.
Is where they would have lynched you from. The kind of slavery we're talking about is unique, easily distinguished from any other form of slavery that has occurred in the history of this world. It's unique for its length of time, yes, but more importantly, because yes, the length of time fulfills a prophecy, but also the nature of your slavery. The nature of your captivity was also unique. Very few peoples on the planet in the history of mankind have had to endure chattel slavery, the irredeemable slave. That's what you were. And the Most High prophesied ahead of time that that would be you. That had happened to almost nobody. At the time that the scriptures were written, the only people in history who had been known to subject anyone else to that kind of slavery were the Sumerians. No one else.
And Yatsarali slavery in Kemet doesn't fulfill the prophecy of slavery and affliction that Yahuwah gave Abraham right after establishing the covenant. If you don't believe there ever was a transatlantic slave trade, the burden of proof is on you, and you can't prove a negative.
I want to caution you against committing yourself mentally to an absolute that you can't possibly prove. It's impossible to prove a negative. This is a fundamental tenet of the science of rhetoric, which is basically the science of argument. Let me put it in different terms for you.
If I say my homie Keontae had sex with a mule, it's impossible for him to now show us a picture of him not having sex with a mule. He'll never prove he didn't do it. The only difference in that case is that the burden of proof is on me to prove that he did because I made the assertion. But, you know, anyone making the assertion that the transatlantic slave trade didn't happen bears the burden of proof. You have to prove it didn't happen. And you'll never succeed because you'll never have photographic evidence of ships not transporting people across the Atlantic. Also keep in mind, some of you don't believe ships brought you from Africa to America, yet you still believe that indigenous blacks were put on ships here in America and shipped to the Caribbean or to a different place in the Americas or even to Europe. That's still very much a transatlantic slave trade, and no one ever lied to you about it. That's mainstream information that some of you simply forgot or didn't know. White people also forgot, and many of them don't know either. I'll do a separate video on vetting various theories on all this, and I will definitely address in more than one video the Slave Voyages Project, anchored by Rice University and countless other institutions. But the significance of this video and this conversation is that in whatever way it happened, the Tanakh already foretold it. We can debate which directions the ships were going some other time, but at present there is absolutely no legitimate evidence to refute the notion that A, there were slave ships, and that B, the slaves were black people. You're welcome to drop comments to the contrary, but I'm moving on. Please provide receipts for whatever you come to say in the comments. And also, let me just say this, because I'm a stickler for cropping what constitutes a fact and what does not. I'm a journalist, and in journalism, I mean, we can't help but be sticklers for that, because that's our job. That's all we do. Technically, if you're like me, you might drop a comment about how the statement about whether or not there are slave ships. Technically, no, there are not slave ships in the sense of ships that were specifically meant to carry slaves. There were cargo ships that slaves were put on. All that said, Christianity traditionally conflates two prophecies that appear roughly the same but are actually separate. Mixing up these two prophecies is why most people don't notice that one of them was indeed talking about the transatlantic slave trade. One prophecy speaks of the children of Yatzarel enduring a combination of slavery and affliction for a total of 400 years, and in another, the children of Yatzarel are prophesied to sojourn exactly 430 years in the house of bondage. Let's make sure we know where we're coming at for that. Sefer Shemot, which if you're Christian, you refer to as the book of Exodus. Chapter 12, verses 40 and 41. Quote, "Now the sojourning of the children of Yatzarel who dwelt in Mitzrayim was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the self-same day it came to pass that all the hosts of Yahuwah went out from the land of Mitzrayim."
It's important to understand this phrase, this name, children of Yatzarel, is not just referring to descendants of Yaakov, whose blessing name was Yatzarel. And so sometimes some people will use that as reason to challenge the idea that this count for the 430 years can begin with Abraham. And the reason it matters is because if you don't begin the count at the time that Abraham departs from Haran and moves into Canaan, then the 430 years cannot be completed within the wandering. The 430 years has to begin right when Abraham departs from Haran and migrates into Canaan, which is immediately after this prophecy is given. That's the first thing, that's the next thing he does immediately. He does it within that same year. So counting from what age he is then, all the way through to the moment that they enter the promised land, that's 430 years. Many would argue you can't count that way because Abraham is not one of the children of Yatzarel. You can't start counting until the children of Yatzarel are actually born from Yaakov, which is 2 generations later, which messes up the whole count. The term children of Yatzarel actually refers to the fact that even Abraham is a child of Yatzarel. It's because the name of Yahuwah is Yatzarel. She actually describes us, in fact, as a people who are called by her name. How is it that we are called by her name? It's because her name is Yatzarel.
2 Chronicles 7 verse 14. Quote, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves, and pray, and seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, and will forgive their sin, and will heal their land." End quote.
Deuteronomy 28 verse 10, quote, "And all people of the earth shall see that thou art called by the name of Yahuwah, and they shall be afraid of thee." End quote.
Jeremiah 14 verse 9. Quote, "Why shouldest thou be as a man astonished, as a mighty man that cannot save? Yet thou, O Yahuwah, art in the midst of us, and we are called by thy name, leave us not."
Yeah, Yahuwah is not her name, it's what she is. Yatzarel is the proper name of the Great Spirit, and we know this because our ancestors were called by her name.
When I say Mitzrayim, just for anybody who's not up on biblical speak, Mitzrayim is Kemet, which is Egypt. 430 years, the sojourning of the children of Yatzarel in Mitzrayim. 430 years. To sojourn is to be a stranger in a place or to wander in a place. You know, you from Ohio, but you traveling to Florida. When you cross through Tennessee, you sojourned through Tennessee. Tennessee is not where you are from. Let's also understand this whole house of bondage thing. It's actually important to understand that the reason why I say that, some of you already know why I say that, but this is what the root word for Mitzrayim actually means. Tsor, or Tsur, is the root word that Mitzrayim comes from. It means to bind, to shackle, to imprison. It is indeed bondage. That is what it's referring to. And because of this, there are times when the Hebrew word for Egypt, which is Mitzrayim, is used in reference to the concept of bondage. Actually, what I'll do is I'll put some text down in the description box for examples of that. I've got a lot of examples of that, but I'm not going to just read all of them. Now, the problem we have is that both the 400-year prophecy and the 430-year prophecy are traditionally said to be satisfied by Yatzarel's time in Kemet, which doesn't make sense for several reasons. For one, historians have long had issues with the notion that if Israel was in ancient Kemet for 4 centuries, they'd have left some mark of that presence. Number two, the math legitimately doesn't add up for either of these figures, even within the scripture. Number three, the traditional interpretation depends on the arbitrary assumption that the 400 years mentioned in one text is just the same 430 years rounded down. Yet when, you know, the Yatzaralim immigrate from Kemet, the text that describes this process speaks with such exactitude that it suggests it wouldn't have to be rounded down earlier in scripture. The passage we just read says that they came out the self-same day. Down to the day is what it's implying here. It seems to be saying that down to the day they came out 430 years later. That passage happens to also be one of the best examples that what Bible pushers call translations are greatly overreaching the task of just translating something. In fact, it's the reason some people get convinced that the translational process is duplicitous in some way, perhaps because they're deliberately covering up something. If you read this same passage in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the original Hebrew manuscript, you'll see that it doesn't just say they lived in Egypt for 400 years. It says Egypt and Canaan. The Samaritan Pentateuch says the same thing. And if you have a New King James version of the Bible, there's a marginal note on this passage that lets you know what I'm talking about is true. It basically confesses this to you. That changes everything. We're looking for 400 years of slavery and affliction, but also 430 years of sojourning in the lands of Mitzrayim and Canaan. Abraham entered into the covenant with the Most High, the Great Spirit, Eye Asher Eye, at 75 years old. The sojourning begins within that same year because Abraham immigrates to Canaan. So the count should begin at this point. When he's in Canaan, the count really should be starting already. Next, Yahuwah tells Abraham his descendants will sojourn in a foreign land and be oppressed for 400 years of slavery and affliction, right? We didn't look at this part yet. We looked at the 430 years. We didn't look at the 400 years. Where's that coming from? Let's look at the passage where that actually comes from real quick.
Yeah, the Great Spirit told Abram in Genesis 15 verse 13, quote, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years, end quote. So basically the creator of skies and land told Abram that the Israelites would be foreigners in a land that's not the promised land and that they'd be in servitude to another group of people. which could actually be talking about the Babylonian captivity if it wasn't for the part that says they'll serve the masters of that land for 400 years. Now, even though it calls us strangers or foreigners in the land, that's not a challenge to us being indigenous to the Americas. This Hebrew word ger means guest, as in a temporary visitor, a sojourner. While we may have been the first people in North America from a Eurocentric perspective, the Great Spirit does not view this land as our home because we're supposed to be somewhere else.
Nope. Gotta cut you off on that one because I'm very passionate about this. We was always in the Americas, and I know that's hard for some of y'all to accept. The promised land was definitely in the Americas, and so was Egypt. Don't even trip. How is talking about corn in Genesis 27? But corn come from the Americas. Wasn't never no corn in the Middle East on God. Look it up.
I mean, I'm not even trying to touch that with a 10-foot pole. No cap, cause you got no chill. What I'm trying to say is that one way or the other, we not where we supposed to be. Like full stop. I'm not finna argue about where Jerusalem was or where Egypt at. Feel me?
Now, this prophecy of 400 years of slavery and affliction is a different thing, right? It's not the 430 years. This prophecy of the 400 years of slavery and affliction is also something that I hear a lot of black Hebrew Israelites equate with 1619 to 2019. And I understand why. And you can do that, and it's actually, it's valid. But I want to break that down a little bit for several key points that need to be made. It's valid, but I would consider that to be the final wave, if you will. You see, all of our bloodlines have to undergo this 400-year curse. You understand what I'm saying? And don't be getting, up in a tizzy about whether or not we're cursed and, I refuse to accept that, I refuse to accept this curse on me. Good. You shouldn't have to accept the curse on you, okay? You're actually, if you are woke to what's going on, and you are actually living the way you're supposed to live, Yahuwah has already said that when you return to the Torah, all will go well with you. So the curses only apply to those of you who are unaware of the curses and not living in opposition to them. As soon as you start living in opposition to them, they should no longer apply to you. All right? It's entirely within your power to shed these curses. It's on you to shed these curses. You get them off of you yourself. And Yahuwah is only saying that she's not going to do it for you. We'll cover that in another video. But let's focus on these 400 years real quick. First thing I want you to understand is that 1619 to 2019, that's a late count, that's a late wave. There are bloodlines for whom that applies. Many bloodlines for whom that applies. And I fully understand what you're talking about. I'm going to break that down further later in this same video. But first, let me talk about an earlier wave from 1517 to 1867, which is actually 350 years out of a separate 400-year wave that I'm going to talk about later. This subset of 350 years, the 1517, the full 400 years is 1517 for this wave. For this wave would be 1517 to 1917, but I'm gonna get into how we know that later and what the markers of that are later in this same video. But let me just say this about that particular wave. This is an earlier wave of the same slavery, the same affliction. 1517 to 1867 is 350 of those 400 years. And that 350 years that I'm now talking about, I want to make sure that all of you understand, those of you who are in North America, if you're in North America, you need to understand that a lot of you are identifying as Yahudim because you believe you came from Africa. And I want to make sure you understand that you're almost definitely indigenous to this land, because if you look like me and you're in North America, first of all, I'm going to just say you need to do your genealogy for yourself. But from 1517 to 1867, that's the bulk of the slave trade. That's pretty much the whole thing. It's pretty much the whole thing. And in that time frame, in that 350 year time frame, you understand that only 388,000, I covered this in another video, only 388,000 of us were actually brought from Africa to North America. 388,000. That's it. From 1517 to 1867.
Yeah, if you go to our channel page and click the video entitled Black Indians v. Congress 2024, you'll see Ani Unwiya actually break down a data discrepancy between the census and the statistics from the Slave Voyages database. There were over 4 million colored slaves and former slaves as of 1860, with less than 400,000 of them having been trafficked from Africa since 1517. In other words, 9 out of 10 slaves in North America were indigenous. Go check the video out because the Unihia movement needs more support to amend Senate Bill 3019, which is what Ani Unwiya explained in that video.
Way more of the colored slaves were indigenous than from Africa. In fact, I demonstrated that those from Africa only made up 9.8% of the colored slave population, which means if your claim to being Yahudim is that you came from Africa, no, that's a weak claim. Most of the Yahudim went to South America, right? There were 12.5 million slaves brought over here from Africa, but they didn't come to North America. 5.5 million of them went to Brazil alone, just Brazil. So I'm just saying, I'm trying to make sure you understand that.
And by the way, you were still enslaved either way, and you were trafficked by ships either way too. When one person betrays another or exposes them, Americans say, "You sold me down the river." It's the same as saying you hung me out to dry. That's a uniquely American proverb that comes from Indians being sold down the Mississippi River as part of the slave trade. Just like it says in Deuteronomy 28 verse 37, you became a proverb and a byword among the heathens.
Now remember, I said 1917 is the end of that first wave, and there are signs to mark these things, but we're going to talk about that in a second. First, I just want to talk about what this first wave looked like at the end. So again, 1517 to 1917. 1917 is the end of that first wave. Well, in that moment, what actually happens is we have the race riots in Illinois. These race riots are pivotal because they're often connected to the Harlem Renaissance. Whenever you hear anybody talk about the start of the Harlem Renaissance, they often mention that it was coming right on the heels of those race riots in Illinois, right? So
We know you got an opinion about this kind of content. Click the link in the description and go to the Patreon page for the Unihia movement. Members get to post links to their YouTube shorts, and we'll feature them in an upcoming video.
1517 to 1917, the 400th year, 1917, race riots in Illinois. The start of the Harlem Renaissance is what? 1918, the very next year. So year 401 on the dot for that first generation is when the Harlem Renaissance began. And what's critical about that is the fact that a lot of people see the Harlem Renaissance as this very positive thing for our culture, and in some ways it was, and in some ways it wasn't. In truth, it was actually a time of that was going to later contribute to considerable confusion for our people. I'm going to do a whole video about the Harlem Renaissance itself, because I think a lot of people are missing what was so significant about it for our people. Some of what was so significant about it. Many of the things that have been covered about the Harlem Renaissance are greatly positive, and I fully understand why, and it's awesome. And there were some awesome things that came out of it. I'm a Langston Hughes fan because I'm a writer, and I read a lot of his work. So I'm all about it. The Harlem Renaissance is actually a time period in which we reinvented our identity. That was the point of the Harlem Renaissance, and actually you can find that in the written works of authors from that time, like Alain Locke, who's actually talking about the fact that what was so great about this movement he felt like he was a part of, this revival for the Negro, was that it was changing the Negro identity. And in particular, it was changing the Negro identity in such a way as to attempt to shed all the negative stereotypes about Negroes from their identity by way of them donning this new identity, saying, hey, we have a rich culture and we are sophisticated and we enjoy the arts and all of this good stuff, and in order to
get white America to take them seriously on that, they had to reclassify. They had to re-identify themselves. So what did we re-identify as? We embraced the Africanness of about 10% of our populace. We embraced the foreign contingent of the 1 in 10 of us, and began to don that identity for the vast majority of us. And it really doesn't apply to the vast majority of us, right? But the enemy of the white man up until that point has really been the Indian, right? The only good Indian is a dead Indian. You've got to stop being Indian then.
Once again, the Negro is reduced to a proverb. This proverb was so pervasive in the American discourse of the late 19th century that no one can trace who coined it, yet it's attributed to many high-profile names of the time like Alfred Gurney, General Philip Sheridan, and most often Theodore Roosevelt, who became president 5 years after casually reprising the proverb in a speech. It was prophesied that you would be known this way to everyone else.
So Alain Locke's book is actually talking about exactly that. Alain Locke is particularly famous for the New Negro, an interpretation, which sparked what they refer to as the New Negro movement. Because there was a New Negro. The New Negro was African. You see what I'm saying? It's a sophistication that comes from being able to say, hey, we have this incredibly complex history, and our culture is still with us. Our cultures are still with us to some extent, and we are exercising our right to reclamation of that identity by them identifying as African and pushing this agenda. And it would take the next 60 years for this to fully take hold in the American mind, not just of blacks but also of whites, that we are African and not Indian. That began to be the majority thrust. This was actually very helpful to Native Americans who wanted us to identify as African for a long time before that. And I'll do a video about why I say that another time. But yeah, this was a whole thing. There was a revival of black art, black music, black culture, and that's this movement we're talking about. The New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance was an integral part of that. It was the driving force, in fact, behind that. But this was happening all over the country, not just in Harlem. Harlem was the driver of the movement for our people as we became a new people. So right after that first wave of slavery and affliction for our bloodlines, the first wave of bloodlines went through the full 400 years, and then the reclassification began. And and from that point forward, it took several decades because other bloodlines were also exiting their, still matriculating through, I should say, their 400 years and getting into this reclassification as well, and still being afflicted and still coming out of the effects of slavery. So yeah.
Ezekiel chapter 6, verses 11 and 12 expounds on how these curses would be disseminated amongst our people throughout the diaspora based on how close or far we are to the promised land. It says, quote, "Thus saith Adonai Yahuwah, smite with thine hand, and stamp with thy foot, and say, Alas for all the evil abominations of the house of Yatzarael. For they shall fall by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. He that is far off shall die of the pestilence, and he that is near shall fall by the sword, and he that remaineth and is besieged shall die by the famine. Thus will I accomplish my fury upon them." End quote. The promised land has seen famine several times since this was written, and we have people there currently due to the Arab slave trade, which came just before the transatlantic slave trade. For the same reason, many of our people remain near the promised land yet not in it. And the Middle East has been afflicted by war nonstop ever since, from the siege of Jerusalem to the power struggle between Rome and Persia to the consolidation of power under the Ottoman Empire to the Crusades to the infighting among Middle Eastern nations and incessant incursions from Western imperialist forces throughout that history. For those scattered the furthest, which would be the other end of the earth, we've been afflicted with plagues. Yes, we've seen war, but we've actually lost more lives to the plagues, especially since most of the Indians presumed dead are actually hidden in plain sight as so-called African Americans.
Now I want to talk about the signs that end these waves, that begin and end these waves, that mark, that bookend
these waves of slavery and affliction. There are signs, all right? So you just looked at that passage in Ezekiel. The seer Ezekiel tells us that what was supposed to happen is those of us who were scattered the furthest in our diaspora, in the Hebrew diaspora, are the ones who are supposed to get afflicted by the plague. Well, we're talking about many plagues, and it's not just us. These plagues, they target us, right, because they're for us. But how many of y'all are familiar with the narrative of Jonah, right? Jonah is somebody who, and I'm not going to show you the story in scripture. This is a story that a lot of kids get told in Sunday school or whatever. So hopefully you're familiar with it already, but if you're not, just go look up a synopsis of it real quick, or if you're really up for it, if you're into it, by all means, please get in the scripture and find it. There's a book of Jonah. It's extremely short. Just read it, and you'll be done in half an hour. All right, so here's what happens. Jonah is the dude who, spent 3 days in the belly of a whale. That's the part of the story that everybody knows the best, right? The dude who spent 3 days in the belly of a whale. And everybody says, oh, this is the most fantastical story, like it can't possibly have happened, this is ridiculous, absolutely not. Actually, this has happened to several people even recently. This is not a phenomenon that could have only happened to Jonah. It's not as miraculous as you think. There are people today who have been swallowed by large fish and regurgitated 24 hours later and still been alive. It's actually something you can look up. You can find examples of that happening to people. It's extremely rare, but Jonah would not be the only person that that's ever happened to. Now, of course, what's particularly miraculous is the length of time he spent there. He was in there for 3 days. Also, this was not said to be a whale specifically. It's just a large fish. We don't know what type of fish it was. Anyway, this dude, there's more to his story than that. We're not focusing on the fish for what I'm talking about. What we're focusing on is the fact that Yahuwah commanded him to go to Nineveh, which is a fabled legendary city of the Assyrians. He was supposed to go to them and warn them if they didn't repent of their idolatry and other things and return to the Torah, because the Torah was not just given to the Yatzaralim. It's actually meant for everyone. The Assyrians were actually among the purely human peoples, let's put it that way, who were supposed to still have this Torah. The Most High sent Jonah to tell them that if they didn't return to the Torah, to the law of nature, and start living in the original way, Yahuwah was just going to destroy them. And so Jonah didn't want to go tell them this. He didn't want to warn them. He just wanted to let them get destroyed because they were enemies of Yatzarel. So Jonah tried to avoid doing this. Instead of going where he was supposed to go, he tried to board a boat and go and sail to Tarshish, which is the Iberian Peninsula, where we now have Spain and Portugal. He's trying to get away, he's trying to go in the opposite direction on purpose, to get as far away from his assignment as possible so that he don't have to do it. Well, when he gets on this boat, because he's doing something he's not supposed to do, and he's a prophet doing something he's not supposed to do, he's trying to avoid the thing that he was anointed to do. A crazy storm afflicts the ship, and everybody on the ship is almost being tossed overboard. This ship is about to get capsized, and nobody knows why. They believe they've angered some kind of storm god, so they start trying to pray to Dagon and whoever else to save them. Nothing happens. Jonah finally fesses up and says, actually, it's because I've offended Yahuwah. And they know who Yahuwah is because they know who the Yatzaralim are. And they know, oh, you're from that nation of people whose deity is above all deities. We know about that. You're the dragon people, right? Right? We're talking about the age of the 12 dragons. The age of the 12 dragons. So he tells them, until you throw me overboard and everything, nothing's going to get better for you. They throw him overboard, and that's what calms the seas. Their ship is now safe because they don't have this wayward, rogue, Yatzarali man on their ship. And that's how it is for everybody today. These plagues are afflicting people around us because we've been scattered all over the earth. I'm going to do a whole nother video about how it is that we are very much in a Jonah situation with all the other peoples of the world because of our diaspora. We are in other people's boats, all right?
these other countries that we've all been scattered to. These are the ships of our oppressors. Well, the thing is that they have intermingled their society with us as a result. And by having us on their ship, they actually imperil themselves. So they are very much like the sailors who were en route to Tarshish with Yonah on board. They don't even know who Jonah is. They don't know that he's even a Hebrew. They don't know why he boarded the ship. Lots of people boarded the ship. It's a big ship. You know, whatever. He's on board. He paid money to be here, and all they know is this storm is afflicting them, and they can't explain why. And their prayers to whoever else are not working. Here we are experiencing the same thing with the colonizer. The colonizer at this very present moment doesn't realize that they are experiencing many of the plagues they're experiencing because of us. So that's what's happening. These plagues, they often follow the ordained paths of the four winds. All right, and you know, these winds, they are also in synchronous movement with the light of the sun from east to west, right? So, of course, in 1918, Harlem Renaissance, first year after the completion of the 400 years of the first wave of bloodlines of our people. Same year, we get the Spanish flu. Spanish flu comes the same way the colonizer came. The colonizer came to us from the east to meet us in the west and subjugate us. Go to war with us. Same thing with this plague. Spanish flu followed them, came from the east and to the west. It left the Iberian Peninsula and afflicted the Americas last.
If you appreciate the vibe of the video, you gotta give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We post content almost daily, and we do our best to make it high quality.
Spanish flu. This is actually arguably the most historic plague by fatalities, by mortality rate, in all of recorded history. Because the estimated range for mortality for the Spanish flu on the low end is on the low end is 17 million, which is still crazy, but it is as high as 100 million. So the upper end of this range, and it's just an estimate, we don't actually know, and that's a large range obviously, but we don't actually know how violent this plague was for sure. But those are the numbers we can put on it, from anywhere from 17 million deaths to 100 million deaths worldwide. And that means that it very well could have been far worse by mortality rate than COVID or HIV. And so we're talking about a pandemic here. We're talking about a major pandemic. And this is one of the forces of nature. This is one of the powers of the elements. Is pestilence, disease. It's one of the powers of it's one of the forces of nature, and it was deployed against us. And many European colonizers died as a result of being caught in the crossfire between the Most High and us. If he wasn't afflicting us, you might not have got hit, but you know, whatever. So the second wave of afflictions for our bloodlines actually comes in 1580. Keep in mind, all these waves are overlapping each other, okay? They're not supposed to be distinct one after the other. Different waves, same tide, all right? So the waters of affliction come upon us again in 1580, different set of bloodlines. What happens here is 1580 is significant because this is actually when Europeans first established lasting governmental administrations in, Central America and South America. Central America and South America. In that year, we had New Spain established in Mexico. We had a man named Lorenzo Suarez become the new viceroy of King Philip II. That was in New Spain, which is Mexico. Another viceroyalty in Peru
there was the viceroyalty of Peru at the time, sends Juan de Garay to modern, what is now Argentina, to establish the municipality we now know as Buenos Aires. And so all of these governments are being established in 1980, in 1580. From 1580 to 1980 is the second wave. The second wave of afflictions upon the bloodlines. 1981, which is, again, right after you've completed the 400 years, the 401st year on the dot, the very next year, and this is the completion of 400 years of continuous European rule, we get hit by HIV/AIDS. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, which has been arguably the most lethal pandemic in recorded history, depending on, of course, like I said earlier, how what the real count is for that Spanish flu. So far it has killed 42 million people, and it's not stopping. It's still going, right? We all know this. It's still going. Mankind has learned ways to kind of slow it down, but it's still on the uptick. 42 million fatalities and counting. That is marking the end of that second wave. So, final wave of afflictions upon our bloodlines. A set of bloodlines that began experiencing this in 1619, as many people keep hearing, from 1619 to 2019. This is the final wave. 1619 to 2019 is the final wave, a set of bloodlines that begins to be afflicted in 1619. Now must complete their 400 years by 2019. Now, of course, we're not saying that these waves are as distinct as every bloodline experiencing their start of afflictions in exactly 1619. But we are marking these waves, as in 1619 and the years after that, right? Are showing us bloodlines being afflicted in batches, in groups. We've been batched. So of course, with 2019 came COVID-19, and this is just yet another pandemic to mark the end of a wave. Even though we call it COVID-19, and it did start in 2019, for many of us, it was that 401st year that we even heard about it. Came from the east and to the west. And it actually has had a faster mortality rate than HIV/AIDS, even though it hasn't quite killed as many people. We have an estimated range for mortality on this one as well. It's estimated to have killed anywhere from 7 million to 36 million people worldwide to date. The 400 years are said to be of slavery and affliction. So a combination of slavery and affliction for 400 years is essentially what we're looking for. And this is being said right at the beginning of the count for the 430 years, which further confuses things. It leads people to think that these are really one and the same, and maybe the 400 years is just the 430 years rounded down, which it is not. Abraham was 75 years old at the time that this was explained. Abraham's 100 years old when Yishak is born. Now, we can mark these things because
Exodus 12 verse 4. So Abram departed as Yahuwah had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran.
Chapter 21, if you read in verse 5, and Abraham was 100 years old when his son Yishak was born unto him. So there are things that get marked by time in scripture, and we're able to kind of take these time markings and use them to figure out how much time is passing, so that we can track whether or not this prophecy is accurate. The 430-year prophecy or the 400-year prophecy, whichever. We're just trying to see what the heck is actually happening here. Genesis 24, Yishak marries Rebekah when Abraham is 140. And at that point, there are still 365 years left until the mass exodus. Bereshit 25, 19 and 20. And these are the generations of Yishak, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Yishak, and Yishak was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife. So check this out. Basic math lets you know that means since Abraham was 100 when Yisha'ak was born, that at this time Abraham must be 140. And there are still 365 years left to go. We just read verses 19 and 20. If you jump down 6 verses, verse 26, Esau and Yaakov are born when Abraham is 160. It takes 20 years before Yisha'ak and Rebecca finally have children. And this is when that happened. We're talking about Esau and Yaakov, Esau and Jacob. And after that came his brother out, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Yaakov. And Yisha'ak was 80 years old when he bare them. Yisha'ak was 60, so Abraham was 160. This is how we're keeping track of how much time is passing. If we look at verses 7 and 8, it actually already told you the years of Abraham's life, which he lived, 103 years makes 175, with 330 years left until the Exodus. Joseph is born when Yisha'ak is 151. You can find that in Bereshit 30, verses 22 to 24. We're going to look at when Yisha'ak dies, which actually is described 2 chapters before Joseph gets sold. Bereshit 35 verses 28 and 29. I know this is tedious, bear with me. We need to make this point. Quote, "And the days of Yisha'ak were 104 years." That's how long he lived. He was 180 when he died. Remember, when Abraham was 140, we marked that, and there was still 365 years left. And Yisha'ak was 40. Yisha'ak dies at 180. So 140 years should be subtracted from the 365. So there are 225 years left now until the Exodus. Remember I said in Bereshit 37, that was when Joseph was sold by his own brothers into slavery. And it tells you at the beginning of that chapter how old Joseph is. Verse 2, these are the generations of Yaakov. This is Bereshit 37. Verse 2, quote, "These are the generations of Yaakov, Joseph being 17 years old." As the rest of that chapter unfolds, he gets sold into slavery. Not reading all that. But he was 17. So Yisha'ak at that time would have been 168, which would make Yaakov 108. Joseph becomes second in command to Pharaoh. We're skipping way ahead. We can make another mark of time. If we check Bereshit 41, verse 46, let's look at it. "And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Mitzrayim." So there are 224 years left to the Exodus from that point. The midway point would be the point at which we have 215 years left and 215 years behind us. And at that point, Joseph would be 39 years old, and it so happens that that is when he reveals himself to his brothers with 5 years of famine left, because in the chapter that in the verse that I just read, the chapter that verse is in, 7 years were prophesied, 7 years of plenty, and then 7 years of famine to follow. They store up the grain during the 7 years of plenty because of his prophecy, which was given to him by the Great Spirit. And Pharaoh trusted that because he was like, "Yo, you really know what you're talking about, and I can tell." And actually, this is a critical story to understand the dynamic between Yatzarel and Kemet, but I don't have time to go into the significance of this. It's a big deal for the relationship between Kemet and the people that come out of Kemet, which would be the Yatzarelim. But anyway, when they get to the 7 years of famine, they get 2 years into it, and that's the halfway mark. 215 years behind us, 215 years ahead of us.
Let's also not forget that not once, not twice, but 4 times in the same chapter, they mention ears of corn. I reiterate, there was corn in Egypt, which definitely shouldn't be over there in Northeast Africa. So for anyone who's still married, tut his ass backwards, laugh out loud, map we got. Real talk. What you even talk about?
Joseph is 39 years old. He reveals himself to his brothers who didn't recognize him at first. That is because he is disguised essentially as an Egyptian, and not just an Egyptian, but second in command. So he's got the drip, so they're not recognizing him. So Yaakov dies. Now here's the thing, before I get to that. 5 years of famine left at the time that Yosef reveals himself. At that point, Yaakov was 130 years old. Mark this. Yaakov dies in Bereshit 47. And actually his death is drawn out for like 2 chapters. It's a whole thing because he's got to bless his kids and all of this other stuff. But when he dies, he's 147, making Yosef 56 with 198 years left as Yatzarel settles in Goshen, which is a community they lived in, a community of Mitzrayim. Yosef dies himself at the age of 110. I'm gonna go on ahead and give you that marker. Bereshit 50, verse 26. I was gonna read through a whole bunch. That's a lot. I'm going to chalk it up to, yeah, go look it up. Just go and look it up. Starting in chapter 47. Remember before going into that chapter that Yaakov was 130 years old when Yosef revealed himself to his brothers. In that same year, Yaakov moved with his brothers to Mitzrayim. And so when you go into chapter 47, I believe it tells you that he lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years before dying, so that would make him 147. Bereshit 50, verse 26. Hope y'all are keeping up. You just need to kind of, if you really need this count, because you really need to know this, you really want to, and I feel like it's important that we know this. And I'm gonna explain why in a minute. But if you, I hope y'all are keeping up and you know, just kind of jot down these things so that you can refer back to it at any time. Verse 26, Bereshit 50, verse 26, quote, "So Yosef died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Mitzrayim." So he dies at 110. He has a royal burial. There's 144 years left. There's 144 years left before the mass exodus. Slavery and affliction begin for Yatzaralim right away, as soon as Yosef dies, just to be clear. And it does let you know that that was the case at the beginning of Exodus. In fact, I'll just go on ahead and read the first few verses of the first chapter, starting from the very first verse. "Now these are the names of the children of Yatzarel, which came into Egypt," or Mitzrayim. "Every man and his household came with Yaakov," and then it's going to list them off for the next few verses. "Reuben, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yishakar, Zabulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Yaakov were 70 souls, for Yosef was in Mitzrayim already. And Yosef died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Yatzarim, the children of Yatzarel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose up a new king over Mitzrayim, which knew not Yosef. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Yatzarel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pitom and Raamses. And it says, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Yatzarel. But look at this. That started immediately after Yosef died. No passage of time mentioned at all of actual slavery and affliction, which I will point out falls woefully short of 400, and that much shorter of 430. So this slavery and affliction cannot fulfill the prophecy of 400 years of slavery and affliction that we saw. The prophecy of 400 years of slavery and affliction is not even close to fulfilled. We notched only 144 years for that. That prophecy is what's addressed in Deuteronomy 28. I wanted to make sure you got that countdown so you understand beyond a shadow of a doubt that you can count it out and map it out for yourself. If you learned, as per the Christian tradition, that there was 400 years of slavery and affliction somehow built into this this sojourning in Kemet, it is not accurate. So you have to be looking for some other kind of slavery to fulfill this prophecy. Otherwise, this prophecy did not come true, and that actually shoots this entire book in the foot. This specific description of a seafaring slave trade industry has only really occurred a few times in recorded history, and I'll do another video to explore the admittedly subjective evidence that all the people who have ever endured this have all shared the same covenanted ancestry, and I know that that is an incredibly bold claim on my part, but I am going to do a video where I talk about that. This happened in more than just the transatlantic slave trade.